As the first snowflakes of the new year began to fall gently across the small town of Briarwood, Harold Thompson sat in his favorite armchair by the window, watching the world outside transform. At 82, Harold had lived a full life. He had worked as a mechanic for over 4 decades, built his own home with his hands, and raised a family that had long since moved away. But despite all the achievements, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. It was a quiet dissatisfaction, like a faint hum in the background of his thoughts, something he couldn't put his finger on, but knew was there. The passing years had given him a perspective that younger folks often lacked. He had seen the town grow from a humble rural area into a modern community, with new businesses, schools, and families. But with that growth, Harold noticed something else. The subtle, yet undeniable divide among people, an invisible wall that separated those who had always lived in Briarwood from those who were new, and an ever-deepening gap between different backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences. Harold had always been a man of few words, a man who kept his opinions to himself. He had witnessed the occasional disagreement or heated argument over the years, but he had never been the type to get involved. In his view, things had always worked themselves out, one way or another. Besides, what could one old man do to change anything? Yet, on that cold evening, as he stared out at the twinkling lights of the town square, Harold realized he could no longer stay silent. The new year had always represented a time for new beginnings, fresh resolutions, and a chance to turn the page. But this year, the feeling was different. There was a sense of urgency, something stirring deep within him that he couldn't ignore. The quiet discomfort he'd carried for so long had finally reached a breaking point. He thought about his own upbringing. His father had always taught him that hard work and respect for others were the most important values to uphold, no matter the circumstances. But in recent years, Harold had started to feel that those values weren't being upheld as much as they should be. He had seen it in the way people looked at each other. Wariness in their eyes, hesitation in their smiles. Briarwood wasn't the same town he'd grown up in. The catalyst for his decision came unexpectedly one morning, when Harold overheard a conversation between 2 of his neighbors in the local coffee shop. The topic was the new family that had moved into the house on Maple Street. The family was black, and their arrival had sparked whispers among the locals. Some were curious, while others seemed uncomfortable. A few made dismissive comments under their breath, not realizing Harold was sitting at the next table. That was it. It wasn't just about a new family in town. It was about the growing tension that had always been simmering beneath the surface. Harold didn't understand the source of the discomfort, but he knew it wasn't right. The values his father had taught him demanded action. That evening, as the last of the sun's light disappeared behind the horizon, Harold made a silent promise to himself. This year, he wouldn't be a passive observer. He would speak up. He would make sure the town he had spent so many years in could be a place where every person, no matter their background, could feel welcome and respected. It wasn't going to be easy, but Harold knew it was time. The new year had arrived, and so had his resolve. The following week, Harold's resolve was tested in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon, and he had just finished his errands when he stopped by the small grocery store on the corner of Elm and Main. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of strong coffee. Harold liked the routine of visiting the store. It gave him a sense of connection to the community. But today, as he entered, he felt a subtle unease in the air. He noticed Marcus, a young black man, standing near the dairy section. Marcus had only recently moved to Briarwood with his wife and children, and Harold had seen him around town a few times. The young man was tall, with broad shoulders, and an easy smile, someone who didn't seem to mind standing out in a crowd. But as Harold watched, he could see the way some of the other customers were avoiding eye contact with him. A few older men were lingering near the aisles, casting judgmental glances in Marcus's direction, as if unsure what to make of him being in their store. Then it happened. Harold overheard one of the men, a longtime resident named Carl, make a dismissive remark to Marcus as he passed by. You folks ought to stick to your own neighborhoods," Carl muttered under his breath, loud enough for Harold to hear. The words, sharp and cutting, hung in the air like a bad odor. Harold froze, his heart sinking. He watched Marcus's face tighten in that subtle way people do when they are trying not to show hurt, trying to remain composed in the face of an injustice. Marcus didn't react outwardly. He simply nodded politely and continued with his shopping. But Harold could see the tension in his shoulders, the discomfort in the way his hands gripped the shopping cart. He could feel the sting of Carl's words as if they had been directed at him. For a long moment, Harold stood still, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to confront Carl, to tell him that his words had no place in this town, but something held him back. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of years spent avoiding conflict, of staying silent when things weren't right. It was the learned behavior of someone who had seen countless uncomfortable moments over the decades, but had never dared to step into the fray. But today was different. Today, Harold couldn't ignore what he had just witnessed. He had spent his life believing that a lot of things could be solved with time, that things would improve naturally. But now, standing in the quiet aisles of the store, Harold realized that if he didn't act, nothing would change. Marcus's pain wasn't something that would fade on its own. It was a reflection of a larger issue, one that had been festering beneath the surface of his beloved town for far too long. As he walked up to the counter to pay for his groceries, Harold's mind raced. He was just an old man, and in a small town like Briarwood, people didn't expect much of the elderly. But maybe that was exactly what made him the perfect person to start the conversation. He didn't need to make a big show of things. He didn't need to be flashy. All he needed to do was speak up, one step at a time. When the clerk, a young woman named Sarah, handed him his change, Harold paused for a moment. "You know," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, "things are going to change around here." Sarah gave him a puzzled look, but Harold simply nodded to himself, the resolve in his heart growing. It was time. The next morning, Harold woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the night thinking about the encounter in the grocery store, the way Carl's words had pierced the air, and the way Marcus had quietly accepted the insult. The more Harold thought about it, the clearer it became. This was his moment. It wasn't enough to just feel anger or frustration about what happened. He had to act. But the question was, how? Harold had never been one for public speeches or protests. He wasn't a politician, nor did he have any desire to become one. He was just a man who had lived a simple life, and the idea of confronting the deeply ingrained issues of race and division in his town felt daunting. Yet he knew he couldn't back down now. If he was going to make any change, he had to do it in a way that felt true to who he was. He decided to start small. That afternoon, Harold attended the next town meeting, a gathering that took place in the local church hall. It was a place where the town's residents discussed everything from new building projects to school budgets. As he walked through the door, the familiar faces of longtime neighbors greeted him. But Harold's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't just here for the usual discussions. Today, he was going to bring up something he knew no one else would dare to talk about. The meeting began as usual, with a few announcements and updates on town events. Harold listened intently, but couldn't shake the feeling that the room was filled with an undercurrent of tension, an invisible line that separated the people who had lived in Briarwood their whole lives from the newcomers. He could see it in the way people spoke, in the way they hesitated before introducing new ideas or change. There was a reluctance to move forward, a desire to keep things as they were. Finally, after an hour of mundane discussions, Harold knew it was time. He stood up slowly, his creaky knees protesting the movement. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. He hadn't spoken at a town meeting in years, and his sudden presence felt like a shift in the air. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Harold began, his voice a little shakier than he had intended. "But there's something I need to say. I've lived here a long time, longer than most of you, probably, and I've seen a lot of things change. But one thing that hasn't changed is how we treat people who don't look like us or come from here. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold could feel the unease, but he pressed on. I'm not here to accuse anyone, but I've heard things, hurtful things. Things that, if we're honest with ourselves, we should have been calling out a long time ago. I know change isn't easy. It never is. But if we don't start treating everyone with the respect they deserve, then what kind of place are we really building here? There was a long pause. No one spoke. Harold wasn't sure if anyone would, but he wasn't about to back down now. He had said his piece, and he had no intention of retreating. Finally, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. It was Emma, the young teacher Harold had seen around town. I agree, she said, her voice calm but firm. I think a lot of us want to see things improve, but we don't always know how. Harold's right. We can't just wait for things to change on their own. Harold glanced at Emma, grateful for her support. She was young, full of energy and new ideas. Everything Harold wasn't. But that was exactly why they made a good team. Together, they could bridge the gap between generations, between the old ways of thinking and the new. The meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Harold could feel the change beginning, even if it was just a small shift. There was now a subtle openness in the air, a willingness to listen, to understand, and to try. Harold wasn't sure where it would all lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement toward something better. As he left the meeting that night, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path. The road ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but for the first time in years, Harold Thompson was ready to face whatever came next. The days following the town meeting were filled with mixed emotions for Harold. He had taken the first step, spoken his truth, but the silence that followed was deafening. Most of the room had stayed quiet, unsure of how to respond to his words. Some even avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the topic he had raised. Harold couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. Was it too soon for a town like Briarwood to confront such issues? Were people ready to hear what he had to say? It was a few days later when Harold received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was warm and friendly, and it took him a moment to recognize it. Harold, it's Emma Palmer, the teacher from Briarwood Elementary, she said. I wanted to reach out after the meeting. I was really moved by what you said. I think you're onto something, and I wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk more about it. Harold was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to reach out, especially not someone as young and energetic as Emma. The younger generation was often too wrapped up in their own worlds to notice the struggles of the older folks in town, or at least that's what Harold had always assumed. I'm glad to hear from you, Emma, Harold said, his voice still a bit unsure. I wasn't sure how the meeting went over. It seemed like most people didn't know what to make of it. That's just it, Harold, Emma replied. A lot of people are unsure, but I think it's time we start talking about it. I've been trying to do some things in the schools to teach kids about diversity and respect, but the message needs to extend beyond the classroom. It needs to be in the heart of the community. Harold felt a spark of hope at her words. He had always believed that change had to come from the ground up, small steps that built up over time. But what he didn't expect was that someone like Emma, someone so much younger and with such a different perspective, would be just as passionate about the same cause. We need to make this more than just a one-time conversation, Emma continued. What if we organized a community event, something where people could come together, share their experiences, and learn from one another? I think it could be a good start. Harold paused for a moment, considering the idea. It was bold, maybe too bold for some people in town. But Emma had a fire in her voice, a sense of urgency that made him think she was onto something. Harold had always believed that every great change started with a conversation. Maybe this was the first step in creating that conversation in Briarwood. I like the sound of that, Harold said finally, his voice more confident than before. But it won't be easy. There are people who aren't going to like it. They might not want to hear what we have to say." "I know," Emma said. "But the point is, we can't stay quiet anymore. We can't keep pretending things are fine when they're not. If we want a real change, we need to start somewhere." Harold could hear the determination in her voice, and it gave him the courage to move forward. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe it was time for people to stop pretending that everything was fine and start acknowledging the divisions that existed in their own town. "All right," Harold said, feeling a new sense of purpose. "Let's do it. Let's organize this event, and let's invite everyone, every neighbor, every friend. It's time for Briarwood to start talking." Over the next week, Harold and Emma worked together, brainstorming ideas for the event. They knew it wouldn't be easy, and they certainly didn't expect to change everything overnight. But they were determined to start the conversation, and that, they both agreed, was the most important first step. As they planned, Harold couldn't help but think that the best way to change hearts and minds was to show people that they all shared more in common than they might have thought. And perhaps in the end, it would be an unlikely partnership between an old man and a young teacher that would start the transformation Briarwood so desperately needed. As the date for the community event approached, Harold and Emma worked tirelessly to prepare. They rented out the community center, designed flyers, and spread the word through local churches, schools, and businesses. Slowly but surely, people began to talk. Some were intrigued, others skeptical, but there was no turning back. The event had a life of its own now, and Harold could feel the weight of what they were trying to accomplish. But with every step forward, there were signs of resistance. Harold noticed it in the subtle glances exchanged between longtime residents when they thought no one was looking. He overheard conversations in the local diner about the event, some people openly dismissing it, others worried about what it would mean for Briarwood's reputation. A few even expressed that they didn't see the need for any kind of discussion. "Things are just fine the way they are," he heard one woman say. "We don't need to stir the pot." Despite this, Harold remained resolute. He had lived through enough to know that change rarely came easily. But that didn't mean it shouldn't be pursued. And he wasn't alone in this. Emma's energy and optimism were contagious, and she encouraged him when he began to doubt. Still, the skepticism weighed heavily on him. He had always preferred the quiet life, where things were predictable and people kept to themselves. But now, stepping into this new role as a catalyst for change, Harold couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for Briarwood. What if the town was simply too stuck in its ways? The tipping point came just a few days before the event. Harold was walking through town when he encountered Carl, the man who had made the derogatory remark to Marcus in the grocery store. Carl was standing outside his hardware store, leaning on a cane, and gave Harold a stiff nod as he passed by. Harold could feel the tension hanging in the air, like the calm before a storm. Carl had always been one of those people who prided himself on being the true Briarwood resident, and he had never been one to entertain ideas that challenged his worldview. "I hear you're throwing some kind of meeting, Harold," Carl said, his tone flat but not unfriendly. "Some kind of diversity thing, huh?" Harold nodded slowly, trying to gauge Carl's reaction. "That's right. A chance for people to talk openly about what's been going on in town, to make sure everyone feels welcome, regardless of where they come from." Carl let out a long sigh, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know about all that. We've been fine here for years. This town's been good to me, and I don't see why we need to go and change everything." Harold could feel the challenge in Carl's words, and for a moment, he hesitated. It was easy to retreat, to just accept the idea that not everyone would understand or support what they were trying to do. But this moment, standing in front of Carl, was exactly why the event was needed. "You're right," Harold said, his voice steady. "We've had a good life here, but what happens when we stop asking questions, when we stop thinking about how we can make things better for everyone, not just the people we've always known?" Carl was quiet for a moment, looking Harold up and down as if weighing his words. Finally, he let out a resigned chuckle. "You're always full of surprises, Harold. "I'll give you that." Harold nodded, unsure whether Carl's words were meant as a compliment or a challenge. But he didn't care. What mattered was that the conversation had started. The seeds of doubt had been planted. And now Harold had to trust that people would come to the event, not just to listen, but to consider the possibility of change. As the day of the event drew closer, the anticipation in Briarwood grew. Harold could sense the undercurrent of tension that had been building over the past few weeks. People were starting to question whether they should attend, some out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few because they wanted to be on the right side of history. Harold didn't know what the turnout would be, but he knew one thing for certain. This conversation was no longer something he could avoid. The town would have to confront its divisions, whether it was ready or not. The night before the event, Harold sat alone in his living room, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but he knew that no matter the outcome, he had stepped out of the shadows of silence and into a fight for something bigger than himself. It was no longer just about him. It was about the future of Briarwood. And that was worth every ounce of effort. The day of the event arrived with an air of uncertainty that hung over Briarwood. The sun rose over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, and Harold could sense the tension in the atmosphere. He had seen it in the hesitant glances of his neighbors, the whispers that seemed to travel faster than usual. Everyone was talking about the event, some with curiosity, others with clear discomfort. But Harold knew this was it, the moment of truth. He arrived at the community center early, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the murmur of conversations greeting him as he entered. Emma was already there, busy setting up tables and chairs, organizing pamphlets, and preparing for the guests. Her enthusiasm was palpable, even if the nervousness in her eyes told a different story. She was doing everything she could to ensure that the event would be a success, but Harold could see she, too, felt the weight of the challenge. "This is it," she said with a small smile as she saw Harold approach. "The turnout's looking good, but you know how it is. People are still on the fence." Harold nodded. He could feel it in his bones, that mix of excitement and fear that accompanies any significant change. "We just have to hope the conversation is worth having. That people will listen, whether they agree or not." The doors opened at 6 p.m., and people began to trickle in. At first, it was only a handful of familiar faces, the ones who had been curious or open-minded about the idea. Neighbors, friends, a few local teachers, and even a couple of young parents with their children. Harold stood at the door, shaking hands, offering a kind word here and there. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be enough. Then, as the clock ticked closer to the start of the event, the room began to fill. Some of the more reluctant townsfolk arrived, people Harold hadn't expected to see. He caught sight of Carl, who had shown up with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. There were murmurs as others filed in, including a few faces Harold recognized from the church and the town's local businesses. He even saw Marcus, the young man from the grocery store, standing by the back wall with his wife and children. A quiet, resolute presence, just like Harold. As more people filled the room, the air grew thicker. The event hadn't even officially started, but the unspoken tension was palpable. Some attendees avoided eye contact, while others seemed eager to get things started, their faces a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Harold took his seat near the front, alongside Emma, who was fidgeting with a stack of notes. She was prepared for a lengthy discussion, but Harold couldn't shake the sense that something significant was about to happen, something that could either change everything or tear the community apart. The event kicked off with Emma introducing the evening's purpose, a conversation, not a debate. She spoke about the importance of listening to one another, of understanding that the community of Briarwood was more than just a collection of familiar faces. It was a place where people from all walks of life should feel welcomed, heard, and respected. As she spoke, Harold felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. This wasn't just her fight, it was his too. But just as Emma began to open the floor for questions, the first challenge came. It was from a man named Roger, a longtime resident who owned the local farm supply store. He stood up, his voice sharp and pointed. "Why are we even doing this?" Roger asked, his eyes scanning the room. "Briarwood has always been a good place to live. We don't need people coming in here stirring up trouble with this talk about race and division. It's been fine for decades. What's changed?" The room fell silent. Harold could see the discomfort in the eyes of those who had come in with good intentions. They weren't prepared for this level of opposition. But Harold wasn't about to let Roger's words go unchallenged. He stood up slowly, his heart beating a little faster than usual. "I'll tell you what's changed," Harold began, his voice steady. "What's changed is that we've spent too many years pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We've ignored the things that divide us, the things we've been too afraid to talk about. And it's time we face them. Because if we don't, we're only going to stay stuck in the past." The room was quiet again, and for a moment, Harold wasn't sure how his words had been received. He could see the skepticism in Roger's eyes, but he also noticed the shift in the room. People were listening. Then, unexpectedly, Marcus stood up, his calm voice breaking the silence. "I moved here because I wanted my children to grow up in a community where they could thrive, where they wouldn't have to deal with the things I grew up with. But even here, we can feel the divide. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't exist." The room shifted again, and Harold could feel the change. The conversation had started, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. But for the first time in a long while, Harold felt a sense of hope. The storm was gathering, but it was one that could, if they were brave enough, clear the air for something better. As Marcus spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as an uneasy gathering now hummed with a charged energy. People shifted in their seats, some listening intently, others exchanging glances. Harold could feel the tension loosening ever so slightly, as if the walls that had divided the town for so long were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. Marcus's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was no sound. No one knew exactly how to respond. It wasn't just what Marcus had said. It was the fact that he had said it out loud. So often, people in Briarwood had quietly accepted the subtle prejudices, the sideways glances, the unspoken divisions. But here was Marcus, an outsider in their eyes, saying what needed to be said. "We are not fine." The walls between them were real, and they couldn't pretend they weren't anymore. Harold felt a surge of gratitude toward Marcus. He wasn't sure what had driven the young man to speak out in a room full of people who didn't fully understand his struggles, but Harold admired his bravery. It was the kind of courage that Harold had spent most of his life suppressing, his own discomfort with confrontation keeping him in the shadows, too afraid to say what needed to be said. "I moved here because I believed that this place could be different," Marcus continued, his voice strong yet calm. "But I've had to face the reality that difference, in this town, doesn't always mean acceptance." Roger, still standing near the back, let out an exasperated sigh, clearly frustrated by the direction the conversation was taking. "You can't just keep accusing people of things they haven't done," he snapped, crossing his arms. "We're a small town. People know each other here. We don't need to be lectured about acceptance and racism. We're all just trying to live our lives." Harold could sense the frustration in Roger's tone. He had heard it before. The defensiveness that comes when someone is confronted with uncomfortable truths. It was the same tone people used when they felt like they were being blamed for something they didn't think they had control over. But Harold wasn't about to back down. This was the moment to push through the discomfort, to show that their town could be better than this. He stood up again, his heart pounding in his chest. "Roger, nobody's accusing anyone of anything," Harold said, his voice firm but measured. "But we are talking about what's real. What's been real for a lot of people, whether we want to face it or not. If we don't start having these hard conversations, we'll stay stuck in this silence, and nothing will change. Not for Marcus, not for the rest of us." A hush fell over the room. For a brief moment, Harold thought he might have lost them all. It was easy to see how Roger's words could resonate with people who had lived in Briarwood for decades. They hadn't experienced the kind of overt racism that people like Marcus had. They hadn't lived with the constant weight of suspicion or isolation. It wasn't personal to them. But then Emma, who had been quietly watching the exchange from the side, spoke up. "Harold's right. We have to acknowledge what's not being said. The thing is, change doesn't happen by pretending things are fine. It happens by talking about the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, by making sure we're all on the same page." She paused, looking around the room. "That doesn't mean we're accusing anyone of being a bad person. It just means we have to do better. If Briarwood is truly the place we say it is, we can't ignore what's been happening." The room was still, but something shifted. Emma's words seemed to bridge the gap between the people who felt defensive and those who had long felt unheard. It wasn't about blame. It was about acknowledgement and understanding. Slowly, people began nodding, some hesitant, others more confident in their agreement. And then, as if to break the tension completely, an unexpected voice joined in. It was Claire, the local florist, a woman known for her quiet demeanor and kind smile. She had always kept to herself, but now, standing from her seat, she spoke up. "You know," Claire said, her voice soft but steady, "I've lived in Briarwood my whole life, and I've seen things I didn't know how to talk about, things I didn't want to see. I've never wanted to stir the pot, but I think Harold and Emma are right. We've got to start talking. If we want to build a town that truly cares about each other, we have to be brave enough to acknowledge where we failed." The room, which had been teetering on the edge of division, now felt like it was slowly coming together. Claire's admission, her quiet courage, opened something in the air. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of the conversation. A ripple of agreement flowed through the crowd. As more people began to nod, some even speaking up with their own small admissions or thoughts. Harold looked around at the faces in the room. People who had once been strangers in their shared silence were now engaging with each other in a way he hadn't imagined possible. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would still be long, but tonight was the first real step toward change. As the evening wore on, the discussion deepened. Some people expressed their concerns, others shared their experiences, and still, some remained quiet, unsure of how to fully engage. But the silence that had once been the town's greatest barrier had been broken. Harold sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just an event, it was a beginning. And for the first time, Harold believed the town of Briarwood might just be ready for the change it needed. The night of the community event stretched late into the evening, with conversations that flowed beyond the initial scheduled end time. People lingered in small groups, discussing the issues, debating their perspectives, but most importantly, listening. There were still disagreements, but the atmosphere had changed. The walls of resistance had been chipped away, revealing a town that, though hesitant, was beginning to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for so long. Harold stayed at the back of the room, observing the conversations unfolding. Emma, tired but beaming, walked from group to group, encouraging dialogue, offering reassurance to those who were still unsure. He watched as Carl and Roger, the men who had been most vocal in their resistance, found themselves in a quieter discussion with Marcus, the young man who had bravely spoken up earlier in the evening. It wasn't a heated argument anymore. It was a conversation. And that, Harold realized, was all he had hoped for. As the night wound down, Harold made his way to the front where Emma stood, still smiling despite the fatigue on her face. "We did it, Harold," Emma said, her voice filled with relief. "People are talking. Really talking. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Harold nodded, a sense of quiet pride washing over him. The town had taken a step forward. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been smooth, but the conversation was happening. That was the first step to change. "I'm proud of what we did tonight," Harold said. "But this is just the beginning, isn't it? Emma's smile widened, and she nodded. Absolutely. We've opened a door, but now we have to keep walking through it. There are still a lot of people in Briarwood who don't understand what others are going through. It's going to take time. But tonight, we planted the seeds. Over the next few weeks, the town of Briarwood began to change in ways Harold hadn't imagined. Conversations about diversity, race, and community were no longer hushed or avoided. They were part of the everyday dialogue. People who had previously avoided such topics found themselves reconsidering their own biases, reassessing what it meant to truly welcome everyone. It wasn't always smooth, and there were still moments of discomfort, but there was progress. Real, tangible progress. Carl, the man who had been so resistant at the start, began to soften. Harold would catch him talking with Marcus more frequently, asking questions and seeking to understand his perspective. Roger, too, had become more reflective. He no longer dismissed the conversations with a scoff. He listened, even if only to weigh his own thoughts against what others were saying. Harold's friendship with Emma grew stronger, too. Their collaboration had bridged a gap between generations, something Harold hadn't expected. It wasn't just about fighting for a cause. It was about building something together. Through Emma, Harold saw a new way of looking at the world, one that was full of hope, passion, and a relentless drive for change. Emma, in turn, admired Harold's quiet wisdom, the calm persistence he brought to every conversation. They made a great team, and together, they were able to continue fostering a culture of openness and inclusivity in Briarwood. One Saturday, a month after the event, Harold stood outside the community center, watching as a group of young people from Briarwood High School set up tables for a new event. A cultural fair meant to celebrate the town's diversity. It was a small event, but it symbolized something far larger. The community was not only talking about change, they were actively creating it. As the day unfolded, Harold watched the young people, including Marcus's children, proudly showcase their heritage through food, music, and stories. It wasn't just an event for the few, it was for everyone. Briarwood was beginning to look different, and Harold knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the start of something new. Standing there, a quiet smile crept across Harold's face. He had spent a lifetime of his own quietly enduring. But now, in his old age, he had learned that sometimes, to make the world a better place, you have to speak up. You have to start the conversation, even when it feels impossible. And sometimes, the courage to take that first step is the spark that ignites a fire of change. As the sun set over Briarwood, Harold knew one thing for certain. His town was different. It was growing, evolving, and changing for the better. And that was a legacy worth leaving behind.